restroom. We're going to go ahead and get started back up. You good, Logan?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So at this point, we've talked a little bit about application security. We've talked about some ways to protect our application. Dan talked to us a little bit about SQL injection and injection flaws in general and input validation. And so keeping with our OWASP top 10, the next thing that we're going to cover is going to be broken authentication and session management. And the idea of this being that if you're not sure who's using your web app, how do you know they're not the bad guys? So we're going to talk a little bit about what this means. So broken authentication and session management occurs when an application fails to properly protect credentials and session tokens throughout the lifecycle. These being the things that are used to actually authenticate a user with the application. And the attackers attempt to exploit this using a variety of factors. So in some cases, it might be the session ID, which is passed in an unencrypted format, namely like a URL or something like that, not using HTTPS. The attacker is then able to intercept that and use that in order to authenticate with the application. It might be user credentials being passed unencrypted. So when somebody's logging into the application, they enter their username, enter their password, again, not using HTTPS for transport layer security, and their credentials get passed in clear text over the internet. And then the last item here is poor username and password recovery function. In this case, there's some issue with the recovery function that would allow somebody to either get the actual password back or maybe do a password reset using some known values. So the impact here is severe. These kind of flaws can allow some or even all of the accounts to be hacked. Once successful, the attacker can literally do anything that the victim can do because they're authenticated with the application using the credentials that the victim would use. What this means is that typically an attacker is going to target privileged accounts because those are the accounts that have the most permissions, right? So they're going to go after the admin users. We should consider the business value of the affected data and the application functions and the business impact of public exposure of the vulnerability. So what this means is, depending on what type of data is in the application, if it's credit card numbers or HIPAA information, things like that, then our criticality it's going to be even more severe, right? Likewise, if this is a publicly exposed application, the impact could be more secure or more severe. A few different variations of this. So as I mentioned, the attackers could sniff network traffic to recover sensitive data, and that means the session IDs and the user credentials. So if you think about it this way, when you go to your bank website from your system, HTTPS, www.bankofamerica.com, right? What's happening is your system is setting up a secure transport layer connection between your computer and the bank. And even though all the data that you're transacting, the usernames, the passwords, your account information, how much money is in your accounts, transfer money from my account to this other thing, even though all that's happening over the internet, over networks that you don't own, that you don't have control over, and you don't know who does, because you're using HTTPS, that information is encrypted, and hopefully nobody's able to access that data. In the case where it's not encrypted, in the case where we're using a website and it's HTTP, now an attacker is able to, if they're able to insert themselves between your computer and that website, or that server that hosts the website, now they're able to basically grab that traffic off the wire, and they're able to identify what exactly is going on here. Another way that we could do this is if we're able to guess a valid session ID. And so Sam and Kamkar actually talked at Black Hat a number of years ago about PHP session identifiers and about how even though they're supposed to be random, they're not actually all that random. And what he was able to figure out is that if you knew the approximate time and he knew the system and a few other variables that went into this, he was able to take what's normally a very large scope of possible values and narrow it down to a very small scope. And then once he has that smaller scope of possible values, he was able to iterate through them and eventually was able to get to the actual session identifier that authenticated with that application. So if there are ways for us to narrow that scope and make it so that we can guess that session identifier before it expires, meaning before the user logs out or before the application automatically terminates that session, then there's potential for us to gain access that way. The last one here is the attacker exploits vulnerable account management functionality. So these are things like the ability to recover a username, the ability to recover a password, or the ability to reset a password. And if the attacker is able to, let's say they do a password recovery and all of a sudden they get back, they have access to the email or something like that, and it sends back the actual password instead of the password reset link. Well, now they have the password for probably all that user's accounts. We're going to skip past that one. So how do we test applications for this? Testing is usually hard to automate with either static or dynamic analysis. Static analysis meaning we're scanning the actual code, and so we're looking at the code and any vulnerabilities that might exist there. Dynamic meaning we're exercising the functionality of the application itself and getting back, send this input in, get this output back. The reason why this is really hard to do is because it relies heavily on business logic, and the scan tools don't understand that. They don't understand, like, if I enter this username and this password into this field, then I'm a valid user for this application, which this is the scope of the application. They don't get that. They can understand I have a session identifier, because usually that comes in the form of, here's a new cookie that gets set that then associates me with that application, but they don't necessarily understand the logic behind that and what all you're supposed to have access to and what not. So in order to do this, we need to use threat models to target manual attacks. We look for likely attack vectors, and then we verify that they're not successful. So what this really means is manual validation. Somebody has to actually go try out the different attacks that we can do and say, what are the results that I get back? Now, mitigations for this in terms of technical factors, we can use built-in session management facilities for our platform. I mentioned that PHP had an issue a while back that Sammy talked about, but for the most part, if you're using the built-in session management functions, whether it's Java, PHP, Perl, whatever, these applications build in the ability to create sessions, the ability to terminate sessions, the ability to rotate sessions, all these different things. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to try and use those functionalities. And then if there is an issue with that, it usually gets reported, somebody fixes it, a new version of the language comes out, and we're good. The other thing that we want to do is avoid using any sort of custom cookies for session or authentication purposes. There's an example that we do. I guess I should rewind real quick. So when I do this class at NI, and when Dan does the stuff with Den Group, or Dan does the class, usually we couple this with a bunch of labs. And so this isn't just a one-day, let's whip through it all real quick. This is let's talk about this thing, then let's sit down, let's actually do a SQL injection or whatever, and then look at the results, and then let's talk about how to fix that. So you guys are getting kind of the one day, let's blow through this as quickly as possible. So in any case, one of the labs that we end up doing is around these custom authentication cookies. And the whole idea is that somebody invents a way to authenticate with the application. And the way that they do that is they basically create a custom cookie. And they basically take a username and they're like, okay, well for the session identifier, I'm just going to take that username, I'm going to reverse it backwards, I'm going to add a few letters or a few numbers at the beginning, and then I'm going to do some weird character flipping thing, right? And that's not really, that's security through obscurity, it's not really security, right? Because all we're doing is we're obfuscating the method of how we came with this, but just like in the class, it doesn't take relatively novice developers, people new to the concept of security, it doesn't take them more than 5 or 10 minutes to actually figure out how they're going about this. So we want to avoid using any of these custom cookies or session things. We want to stick to the things that our language provides us with. The other thing that we want to do here is we want to build secure logout facilities. And the reason why is if we don't have the ability to log out of our application, this makes it easier for the attacker to brute force that session identifier. And if the attacker is able to brute force the session identifier, so if our session is valid for an infinite amount of time, it never expires, they're able to brute force it, now they're able to access the application just like they're that user. So what this means is we need to destroy the session, we need to invalidate the session ID, and it also means that our logout links have to be somewhere that's prevalent, and it has to be on every page. This is the reason why normally when you're using a website, it's like, oh, top right corner, there's the logout link, right? It's very prevalent, it's right there, because they want you to log out of the application. The other thing here is enforcing session timeouts. So we want to make sure that the application, if somebody isn't using it for 15 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, whatever the case may be, whatever our business requirements dictate, we're going to log them out of the application. And in most cases, there's no reason why a user should have access to the application once they're logged in and not using it for more than, say, 8 hours, right? Because most of us aren't at our desks for more than 8 hours. We go home, we sleep, whatever. For that application to be authenticated beyond that point in time, it's really just an exercise in somebody trying to brute force the credentials. We don't want to put sensitive data in URLs or logs. If we put sensitive data in URLs or logs or things like that, they'll end up in the web server, or we might cache it somewhere in the web server. It may end up in our browser history. There have been hacks that allow people to grab information on the browser history. So any of this kind of thing, we want to make sure that we keep it out of there. There are some times where you would need to pass some sort of authentication credential in a URL. Namely, like when you're interacting with an API or something like that. Sometimes you use an API key. For those situations, you want to make sure that you're using secure transport layers, so HTTPS, and you want to basically make sure that that information is being sent securely and not being cached. So the last piece here, don't rely on unreliable factors for authentication. Sometimes it's tempting to be like, okay, well, that user is always going to come from this IP address. And so I want to make sure that they're coming from that IP address, and I'll associate that with the username. This does two things. One, it breaks it any time that user tries to go from another IP address, right? Because now they're not able to associate with that. And then two, when you're using an IP address, somebody can easily spoof that information. So it's not really that strict of something to rely on. It's actually something that's fairly nebulous. Somebody can spoof the IP address, and therefore they can access the application that way. Same thing with referrer headers. All right, when it comes to business logic design, we need to require users to enter their own password when they're updating their passwords. What this does is it forces an attacker, a potential attacker, they can't just use the session ID or brute force the session ID or get, via sniffing, go to traffic, and then all of a sudden change the password and lock you out of the application. They would have to know the password in order to change the password, right? So they have to log into the application, they go to the password change screen, and it says, what's your old password? Now enter the new password. We also want to use strong secondary authentication functions. So what this means is when we're doing some sort of a password reset, those password reset questions shouldn't be like, what color is your car, right? Because there's only certain colors out there. There's an interesting story, it's a little bit dated now, but back when Sarah Palin was running for president, she could see Alaska from her house, right? Or Russia from her house, rather. There was a hack, and the hack happened to be from, I believe it was her Yahoo email account. Somebody was able to access her email. And the way that they got access to this was actually through the password reset functionality. At the time, Yahoo had some questions that were up there, and one of the questions was, what kind of car do you drive? And when the answers are, I drive a Pinto, a Toyota Prius, or a Mercedes-Benz, right? And you're looking at Sarah Palin, you're kind of like, well, I don't think she drives a Pinto, right? And she probably doesn't drive a Prius, because Republicans, they won't like the environment. So obviously she drives the Mercedes-Benz, right? So in that case, they enter the answer, they enter that from the answer, they were able to get the password out of that, and then they were able to access her account. So this is why secondary authentication function should be a free-form task. We basically want to make sure that the user is able to basically ask their own question, and hopefully it's not something where the answer is just blue or Mercedes-Benz. Hopefully it's something like, who was your favorite kindergarten teacher, right? Or who was your favorite teacher? And then the answer is going to be something that unless if somebody went to that same school with you and knew all that information, they probably wouldn't have the answer for that. Certainly not a stranger. The last piece here is be careful sending sensitive information via email. Email is clear text. Email goes over the internet, and unless if you specifically use something like PGP for encryption, it's clear text. So if you send passwords over email, if you send any sort of confidential information, that means that anywhere between where your email originates and where it's going to its destination, if somebody is able to see that traffic, they're able to see the content of the email. Same thing with file attachments and things like that. So when it comes to password functionality, we want to make sure that our emails are not sending the password. We want to make sure that they're sending random identifiers. So long, random, uppercase, lowercase letters, digits, things like that. And it's, hey, when you get this, you click the link, it goes to here, and then it allows you to change the password. We never want to send them an email back that says, here's your password. One, because that means that they're now able to see the password, and studies have shown that most people use the same password, or at least some form of that password across all of their sites. Bad practice. But two, if we're able to send that password back to them, that means that we're storing their password in the database, right? And we should never be storing a password in the database. We should always be storing a password hash. So a couple of reasons why that's bad. Our emails should have random identifiers. The random identifiers should also expire after time and upon use. One second. Because if they're valid for a long period of time, then we run into the same issue that we have with the sessions. We're now, instead of guessing the session identifier, all they're doing is they're basically guessing that, that reset link. And then the last piece here is notification. If we notify users of any changes that happen on their account, then we're basically saying, hey, somebody did something, and if that action wasn't an action that they actually took, then we're basically allowing them to take action and say, hey, somebody's doing something weird on my account. They can contact the company, reset their password, change their email, whatever the case may be. Sorry, yeah?
Answer the question.
Oh, perfect. All right. I love it when I have that precognition. I'm just able to think about what you're going to ask before you ask it. Other questions? Cool. All right. So Java-specific safeguards here, really just what I said before. Use built-in J2E web session management from your application server. We shouldn't try and roll our own. Really, we shouldn't try and roll our own pretty much anything. If the language provides us the capability to do that, we should probably use the capabilities that the language provides. So recap here. Many web applications have both technical and business issues with the way they handle user authentication and session management. There's a bunch of different ways that these guys can surface. We talked about HTTP versus HTTPS. I'm going to get on my high horse real quick for a second. As developers, as security people, it is our responsibility to show people the right way to do things. And nothing bugs me more than a security person who puts up their own little web app or whatever to request a firewall change or whatever, where it has authentication and it's HTTP. It's like, that's a major fail, guys. We need to make sure that any of these pages that we're putting up, where it's collecting sensitive information, using login credentials, providing data back, that we're using HTTPS, right? We should be eating our own dog food. So off my high horse there. We kind of talked about the rest, to guard against it. We need to make sure we're using our platform session management capabilities and think through the business logic around that. Any questions before Dan comes up and talks about cross-site scripting? Yes, sir.
Sort of a comment.
Yeah.
As a DevOps guy, one of the things that I see is developers sometimes reluctant to move to the next generation of their web engine, their Tomcat, and that's where all of your security is evolving in your web engine. So, getting longer session IDs, better session organization, it's all happening there. So it's important not to accrue technical debt and not, keep up with that.
Absolutely, and in fact, Dan kind of mentioned it earlier too. One of the other OWASP top 10 things that we're going to talk about is security misconfiguration, and a lot of this stuff comes from having that is the old versions of the application, old APIs and things like that in our code. And something that we struggle with, frankly, is when we release our applications, like, hey, we found this really cool code that does graphing, right? I can make nice pretty charts and put them in my application. And so you go and you put that in your application, you're like, cool, it's working, it's displaying the nice chart, everything's good, and then you move on and you do all your other functional things and you do whatever. You never actually go back to that thing because it works like you expect it to work, right? It still makes the pretty charts regardless of what version we're on. And the fact is that company that made that thing, they're constantly improving, they're constantly evolving whatever that product is. And if we're not going back and saying, hey, what's the latest version of this? And we're not keeping track of that as we go and develop our app, they're going to be finding vulnerabilities in that thing. They're going to be finding issues. And you're not going to know about it. You're not going to update your application, and their vulnerabilities now become your vulnerabilities. So absolutely, that's a great point, that we need to make sure that we are tracking not only our application code, and we'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end, but also the code that makes up our application, even if it's not stuff that we write. Austin, yeah?
Josh, could you speak a little bit more about the need for session expiration and kind of put yourself in the shoes of a consultant, explaining that to the
Yeah.
application developer as they've authenticated and they're logged in, which one above them?
Yeah, so Austin asked me to elaborate a little bit on session expiration. So I guess with session expiration, basically what we're saying is once you log in to an account, you are trading your password for a new type of key, right? Instead of using that password, which is just one time to get into the application and prove that you are who you say you are, now you're getting this session that ties you to that application. And what happens is that session identifier, that credential, is now the thing that gives you all the permission possible, all the capabilities possible to do with that application. And so if somebody else is able to get that session credential, if they're able to get that information, they're basically you. They have the same permission that you have in that application. And one of the things that we really do struggle with in the security space and as developers is how long should that credential be good for? And I think that the default is like, well, once I give it to them, they should be able to have access indefinitely. They should always be able to use that. Because that's, they already proved that they are who they say they are. But when we think about that session identifier is only as good as its length and its complexity. And so if, as computing power evolves, we're able to guess that faster and faster. If there's no method to detect any brute force or things like that, it means that an attacker is basically able to run a whole lot of different combinations and try and guess that. And the only limitation, the only thing that we can stop them, that we can put in their way, is to say, you only have X amount of time to guess that credential. And that X amount of time is however long that credential is valid, that identifier is valid. And so basically what's happening here is we have to determine what that is. And this is the reason why, like in your banking site, for example, it'll usually say, hey, we've noticed you haven't been active for 10 minutes. We're going to terminate your account. We're going to log you out automatically. Because the risk is so high, the potential impact is so high, that if they don't do that, there's potential for an attacker to have access to your account. So instead of doing the usability thing, which is, hey, let's keep their banking session open all day long, they opt for the security, which is, we're going to go ahead, we're going to terminate their credential. We know it's a little bit harder, but the user can log back in, they can show that they are who they say they are. Is that good?
So like in the banking example, a lot of times they'll have a button click, like, no, I'm still here.
Yep.
Is that refresh the session?
Yeah, so actually what typically happens underneath the application is it's looking with every request that you make. And it's saying, hey, after, let's say, 10 minutes, if the user is still active, if they're still doing stuff on the application should automatically rotate that session credential underneath you. You have no idea that's happening, but it's actually going to invalidate the old credential to prevent the brute force, and it's going to give you a new credential. So now you're basically rotating the keys without you even knowing it. You still have that session, but now an attacker starts back from point 0 to be able to access that application. They're basically just doing the guessing all over again. And so that is the banking piece. If it says, hey, your session's about to expire, would you like to continue? You're basically manually kicking off that, hey, let's change it, let's get a new session ID, or preventing it from invalidating the old one.
So that's more user-friendly than having to redo your credentials, which is, that's a bit more secure, because if you kind of wandered away or you had something like that would stop someone to then redo your credentials.
Yeah.
Basic trade-off.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely going to be. I wouldn't say it's necessarily more secure than having them re-enter credentials. I mean,
Well, I mean, the opposite. Secure credentials is more secure.
Yeah, credentials is more secure. It's more about the usability factor, absolutely. Where it's easier for the user to just say, yeah, it's still me, I'm still here, than it is to basically every 10 minutes say, hey, prove you are who you say you are again, right? So yeah, that's basically what's happening underneath. Cool.
Okay, thanks, that was good.
Yes, sir.
Two things you haven't talked about, and I'm just see if you have any brief guidance on it: multi-factor authentication and federation.
Yeah. So multi-factor authentication, awesome. And I'm glad you brought that up. So multi-factor authentication basically says we're going to take something we know, which is usually the password, and we're going to add to it one of a couple other pieces. Something we have or something we are. Something we have might be a cell phone, it might be a little token, something like that. And something we are is basically talking biometrics. It might be a retinal scan, a thumbprint, a handprint, whatever the case may be. And the idea being that if somebody compromises our password, I said earlier, a lot of people reuse the same password across multiple accounts. Horrible practice. You should always use long random passwords across everything and use the password management tool. That's probably a whole different soapbox topic. But the idea being that if your password credentials do get compromised, let's say you were part of, there was a Yahoo hack not too long ago where they thought the password credentials might be compromised. Let's say you're a part of that and your credentials do get compromised. Multi-factor authentication basically says they may have my credential, but they can't still access my account. Because if they have my password, they still need to have my cell phone to be able to click, yes, this is me, that's the something I have. Or they still have to do my thumbprint or whatever in order to access this application. So multi-factor authentication, it's part of that whole defense in depth. We're adding another barrier that an attacker has to overcome in order to be able to access the application. So that's huge. The other piece they said is single sign-on, sample authentication, that kind of thing. I would say the main benefit with that is you're able to basically ensure that the application adheres to whatever your corporate policy is. So this usually isn't something, federated identity, there are ways to make it work with kind of a public identity database. But the primary way that you'll see that is it gets integrated with your corporate Active Directory infrastructure and allows you to access applications that are like SaaS type of applications. The nice thing about it is that it basically uses your Active Directory username, your Active Directory password. It doesn't authenticate you on their system, it authenticates you on your system, and then it basically sends a token that validates you on that system. The other nice thing is that when it comes to termination, if that user gets terminated in your Active Directory, then it gets terminated on that platform as well. So in my environment, I always encourage my users, when they're looking at SaaS applications and things like that, don't use the local user accounts that they usually provide you. Ask if we can do the SSO implementation. One, because it makes it easier on the users. It's usually just click and you're logged in. And two, because then it adheres to our corporate password policy or termination practices, things like that. So yeah, SSO is fantastic.
I was actually thinking more in terms of federation, like use your Facebook login. Are there risks that developers need to consider when they use those federated approaches? I mean, I think it's important.
So yeah, absolutely. So what he's asking is he's asking more in terms of like the would you like to use Google in order to authenticate with this application, or would you like to use your Facebook credentials to authenticate with this application? You know, for the most part, there's probably nothing wrong with that. You're using credentials that are as good as what you put in there, right? So if you're on Facebook and you use long random passwords, whatever, you're basically saying that that's what I'm going to use for this site. And it's not like the site is going to get your password or anything like that. The way that federated identity works is it's going to redirect you to that site where you enter the credentials on Facebook or Google, and then it's going to send a token back to them saying, yes, this user has properly authenticated, right? So it's not like somebody's going to compromise your credentials that way. That said, you're putting a lot of faith into that company as the provider of your identity. And if something happens, if they get hacked, if there's some way for a user to basically spoof that, yes, this user is that user, now they get that access to everything else. So me personally, there's very, very few circumstances where I'll actually use that federated identity, at least from those providers, because I don't put my faith into other users, I put it in myself. And so I'll usually just use KeyPass, I'll generate a random password, I'll use my email account for that, and that's usually how I'll handle it. Yeah. That answer your question?
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking, as a developer, are there any particular, vectors or risks that you need to be aware of if your business requirement is that you have to use that?
Yeah, don't write it yourself. Don't try and again reinvent the wheel. We don't want to be writing the SAML or the shibboleth or whatever. We don't want to write that spec. Usually the applications or the languages themselves will provide some sort of method for doing that, or there might be a good API or something like that that you can use. But in those types of situations, I would probably recommend not trying to write the authentication to the spec and instead find something that already does it for you, hopefully in the language itself. Other questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify my understanding one point real quick. So after the user logs into a web application, their session ID is sent with every single request that they make. The only thing collecting that is the
Yep. Yeah, that's correct. So what it was saying is, once you authenticate with the web application, at least this is with cookie-based authentication, what basically happens is your session gets stored on the server, and it ties you back to that. The other piece is your cookie, and your session ID gets stored in your cookie, and then your cookie is basically what your browser sends with every single request. And so the distinguishing piece that he was making was, because that's getting sent with every request, for example, if I'm transacting via HTTP and I hit that site via HTTP instead of HTTPS, that cookie gets sent in clear text as my means of authenticating to whatever the web application is. And that means that anybody between the server and or between the client and the server who can intercept that request can intercept the cookie and they can get my session information. So yeah, that's a good point. And I guess on that topic, we should probably say that there is a flag that you can specify in your cookie as a developer that's called the secure flag. And basically what that secure flag does is it says only send this cookie if they're authenticated via HTTPS. So that, as a developer, is something that you definitely want to do in order to ensure that that cookie doesn't get sent in clear text.
Is there any other kind of major or common way to do user authentication that doesn't use the session?
Was it Windows authentication? Yeah. His question is, are there other ways to do authentication that doesn't use the cookie-based authentication? So there's Kerberos, which uses tickets. That's the Windows-based authentication mechanism. You can do authentication as part of the actual URL string. So like if you're making API calls and things like that, you can pass a key that way. There's HTTP basic authentication. So there's a few other ways, but the vast majority of the web applications that are out there are all going to be using the form-based authentication, which uses the cookies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes you find that an application has the cookie authentication, but it also is looking at the IP address.
Mhm.
Right? see that whenever I'm in an application and I get it, and then it says, sorry, I see what are the upsides and downsides in that?
Yeah. So the question is, what are the upsides and downsides of you including an IP address in your authentication? Upside is it's just one additional factor, and you're basically able to say, when that user logged into this application, they were at this IP, and so if it changes, then we need to re-authenticate them. The major downside is that your application will not work for any company that uses a proxy. For example, like back in the day in America Online, your IP was constantly changing with all the different requests. And so something like that, which tied you to an IP address, would mean that as soon as you get a new IP, the application breaks. The other downside, I guess, is that the IP address is something that can be spoofed anyways. So, you know, it's not a foolproof way to authenticate the user, and can be abused. So it may be something that, one of the things that we're starting to get into in the security industry is this concept of risk-based authentication, where you effectively look at different attributes of the user when they log in, and based on that, you might do something like multi-factor authentication. So a change of IP address, while not a, oh my god, that's an attacker, it might be a sign that something might not be right. And so you flag that and say, that's a risky behavior. Or if the user always logs in from Austin, Texas, and suddenly they're logging in from Penang, Malaysia, that might be a sign of something that's a little bit more risky. And so one of the things that we're starting to see in the security space is vendors that are doing this kind of analysis of what is the risk involved with this user, and then based on that risk, should we do something like give them a second factor of authentication, re-authenticate the user, make them re-enter their password, things like that. So that's something that we're starting to see as a trend. Other questions? Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I love
So
it.
many questions.
Keep it up.
So one of the things that I see sometimes is, especially in the financial world, first time you're logging in or trying to create an account, the app will use publicly available data from data brokers to try and identify. It will say, for example, of these 4 addresses, which one of you never lived at? And they, so they take 3 from maybe your credit history,
Yep.
and then they make one up out of the air. What do you think about that?
So the question is, sometimes you'll see companies pull data from like a credit source or something like that, and offer up like multiple addresses or something like that, and say which one have you lived at or which one haven't you lived at, and use that as kind of a means of authenticating who you are, and what do we think of that. Usually, I'll give you an example recently where I experienced this. So I decided to take a driver's safety course in the state of Texas. And one of the things that they do is they will give you, every once in a while, and it's completely random, they will pop up a question like that, where it's pulled from a source and say, hey, what is the address that you used to register with? And you have like 1 minute to basically prove that you are who you are and you're not paying somebody to do the training for you online. What do I think about that? I mean, it's annoying because I'd love to hire somebody to do it for me.
Is it secure? Are there paths to?
So the same way that they're able to get that data, there's ways for other people to get that data too. I would say it's probably not secure. It's just one more way to try and say that you are who you say you are. And I think a lot of the security that we practice today, especially when we talk about the basics, is really about keeping the honest people honest. And I equated this earlier to the locks on your doors. Any of you guys who stick around for the conference, I highly recommend that you go into the room across the way. Jay Gore and Alec and a few other people will be running a lockpick village there. And what you realize sitting with these guys is that locks really, like, there's 1,000 different ways to break them. There's 1,000 different ways to open those locks. And as an attacker, if you know any of those ways, you can basically get into anything. And so, like, I've got my lockpicks in my bag, and there was a time a while back where my friend got locked out of his house, and I was like, hey, no problem, open the door, right? So locks and a lot of these basic security things are about keeping the honest people honest, right? Dan talked earlier about the input validation stuff and how that's not the prevention for SQL injection, but it's a good start. Input validation is about keeping those honest people honest. Anytime we do client-side security, it's about keeping the honest people honest. So I think that a lot of this stuff is really in that vein. It's how do we raise that barrier? How do we put that defense in depth in place so that there are enough hurdles there that an attacker will want to move on and go someplace else because it's an easier target? Does that make sense? Yeah. It's a long way to answer your very short question. All right, we're good? Cool. Let's go ahead. Dan, you want to do cross-site scripting, and then we'll do a lunch break? Awesome.
All right. I was thinking back all that talk of the session management and whatnot. I wrote a HTML rewriter that would include a user or a token session ID and all the links and whatnot. But in the way that we calculated that session identifier was with a call to system.current time in millis. Is that approved? Is that a lot of entropy there? Hard to guess. Hopefully none of that code is still running. Actually, I think a lot of the code, when I think a lot of the code I wrote, I hope none of it's running. Okay, good. Now we're going to talk about cross-site scripting. And cross-site scripting is really important because it's, if you look at a lot of the stat reports that different vendors put out, kind of aggregate testing statistics and whatnot, cross-site scripting is often the most common, at least reasonably serious vulnerability. And it involves an attacker not attacking your application directly, but instead an attacker attacking the users of the application by trying to take control or to misuse their browser. Really, really common for folks. Is everybody here doing web applications? A couple IoT people. So this occurs when an application takes data from a user and sends it back to a web browser without validation or encoding. And the result is that the victim's browser renders this HTML and potentially executes JavaScript that's chosen by the attacker. Again, this isn't a direct attack on the application. It's an attack on the users of the application, which again, then in turn can have a negative impact on the application. And there are a lot of exploitation scenarios. Sometimes they include some social engineering. But very, very common web application security issue, and it's there's a number of variations. So we'll look at stored cross-site scripting, reflected cross-site scripting, and DOM-based cross-site scripting. And I remember getting in a huge argument with someone, like a security director for an organization, and she refused to admit that cross-site scripting was a problem because it was like, well, that's something that happens in the user's browser. But if people can take over the user's browser, they can maybe do bad things. You're like, I don't know, we're not worried about that because that's a user browser problem, which I guess saved them some time fixing all the cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that we'd identified in their application. So it's a time saver in that regard. I don't know that made their organization and certainly not their users were not more safe because of that attitude. I think across the board, though, everyone else I've ever dealt with will recognize cross-site scripting is an issue. And so, looking at the first variant of stored cross-site scripting. This is a scenario where an attacker is going to post some sort of a payload and get it stored inside of a database or some other data store. And a victim is going to use typically the same site, and they're going to visit a page where that content that the attacker had posted or that had caused to have stored, where that is going to be displayed in that victim's browser. This payload gets rendered and executed in the browser. So this is the type of things that you find in, like a good example would be a message board. So I go to a message board and I post, I like sailboats, plus a bunch of JavaScript stuff that I want to run in someone else's browser. Then the victim comes to that message board. They also like sailboats, so they go and look at my post. When the web application renders that HTML and grabs the post data out of the database, posts my stuff about sailboats, but also renders all that JavaScript and stuff just directly. It doesn't do any sort of encoding, and so that JavaScript arrives in the victim's browser as HTML and JavaScript that's going to get parsed and executed, as opposed to additional content. So that's a situation where I can go in potentially as the attacker and access the cookies that that are in that user's browser, potentially cause that browser to cause posts back to page, all kinds of stuff. And especially as we see, as an increasing amount of data is stored in user browsers, that just increase the potential impact. And so a message board is a great example where I can do horizontal privilege escalation. I can take over the identity of another user via their browser and cause bad things to happen. Another thing that we see in a lot of scenarios when we're doing testing of applications is vertical privilege escalation. And that would be like a great example of this. We're doing a pen test for an organization in the real estate space. We were able to go in and in our, to look at our profile, we could save in our profile and add, name, first name, last name, some other stuff like that. We were able to post a whole bunch of HTML and JavaScript in one of those fields, and it got saved into the database. Then we were able to call in to the call center and have the customer service representative pull up our account. Well, when that CSR pulled up our record in the account, that JavaScript and HTML got rendered in their browser and executed, and so we were able to do things as if we were that administrator. So those are the types of scenarios where I'm able to store something, or the attacker is able to store content, typically in a database, maybe some other data store, but then where that gets rendered out as JavaScript and HTML directly to some other unwitting user. So just to see kind of a diagram of this, the bad guy posts something into a message board as a new post, stored in the database. Later on, an unsuspecting user goes and views that post, and as they're viewing that post, all of that JavaScript and HTML gets rendered in their, gets rendered and executed in their browser. We also look at reflected cross-site scripting. So before we were storing this information, it was going and being viewed by someone else. In reflected cross-site scripting, you've got an attacker who's going to craft some sort of a malicious link containing a payload. And then the attacker is going to make that link available for a victim to click. We talked earlier, there's often some aspects of social engineering associated with exploiting cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So this victim encounters this malicious link and clicks on it. The web application takes some of the content passed in from that link and renders it in the browser where that gets executed. So kind of a canonical example of this is like a login page as a convenience to users, right? If someone tries to log in, as a usability measure, you want to say, well, if someone tries to log in, but they get the password wrong, or the login fails for whatever reason. When I re-render that login page, I want to render their username in there so they don't have to retype it, right? Wouldn't that be nice, right? And so the behavior of the system is, if I'm rendering this page and I have a login parameter or a username parameter, I'm going to render that in the form that gets spit out when the page gets rendered. The problem is if someone crafts a link where they say username equals, bracket script, grab cookies, do whatever, and you get someone to click on that link, well, when their login page renders, instead of the username showing up there, that JavaScript is going to execute. Another example that we see in a lot of cases are like message pages, where you want to render, you need to render arbitrary or a large number of messages out to users, error pages or something like that, where you say an error occurred because something happened. Well, a very easy way to do this, and as a developer, I'm very good at being lazy, as I hope many people in this room are as well. So if you've got a situation where, hey, I need to render like some set of error messages, let me just make an error message or like a message page, and I can pass in as a parameter the message that I want to render, right? So I can just do a redirect that shows this page. As I get new error messages and things, like I don't have to register logos anywhere. I've just got this general purpose page that'll show whatever, that'll render out a little message that I want to show. Well, the problem occurs there is if you've got your message.jsp, question mark message equals, if that content gets rendered and executed without being HTML encoded, that thing that saved you a bunch of time is actually potentially a really bad vector exposure for cross-site scripting. And so, kind of look at an example here. What we see is the bad guy is going to create, is going to find this reflecting cross-site scripting vulnerability and craft a link that when that page renders is going to execute some JavaScript that they're choosing. They can send out a spam email, maybe a directed spam, something like that, sends it to a user. They click on a link in that email, the payload gets passed to the server and then rendered back. So it goes out in the HTTP request and gets reflected or rendered back out in the HTML stream that comes back and then executes in the target's browser. Same thing if we've got, if I've got a website or something where I can put a link that people can click on, get that visitor to click on that link or to find that link and click on it again. They click on the link, the payload is passed into the server and reflected back to the user and executes in that victim's browser. Any questions about that? The mechanics of this can be a little, can be a little goofy. But again, what we're looking for in the case of stored cross-site scripting is where I have the ability to store something in a database where that's going to get rendered in another user's browser. And reflected, it's a case where a parameter, where a page is going to take stuff passed in from a parameter and just reflect that back out, and the kind of social engineering that goes around that. In DOM-based cross-site scripting, it's a similar situation where I'm going to craft a malicious link that contains this payload, and the attacker is going to make that link available for the victim to click. Victim encounters it and clicks, and the client-side code is going to parse and use some of this user-supplied data to make decisions, right? And so if you think about situations where if you're writing JavaScript that is going to access something like these constructs, where you're going to say, my JavaScript is going to look at document.url, document.url encoded, document.location, refer, window.location. If you have JavaScript that is parsing those to say, maybe I'm going to know something about something in the URL, and that's going to make me display one message or another, or I'm going to have like the hash my anchor tag or something like that. If you're using JavaScript and parsing those, it's important to understand that those values are at least partially under the control of an attacker. And so if you are making decisions based on those, you have to treat those as if they're malicious. Any questions about that? That's of the three, you go from stored cross-site scripting, which is I find to be very straightforward, to reflecting cross-site scripting, which makes me think a little bit, to DOM-based cross-site scripting, which is again, I think a little harder to spot the situations where these types of problems can creep in, because it's limited to situations where you're doing client-side JavaScript parsing of these types of potentially native values. So the impact here is moderate, and it can certainly be very bad in certain situations. But if you ask me the question, would you rather have an attacker running code on your database server or running code in one of your users' browsers? I'd probably pick the user's browser, right? Again, it's, different scenarios. But so the impact here is an attacker is going to be able to execute scripts in a victim's browser. And that's going to allow them to do all kinds of stuff. They're going to be able to hijack user sessions, potentially make it look as if websites have been defaced, insert hostile content, potentially redirect users to other sites, hijack the user's browser, malware, all kinds of things. If I can control HTML and JavaScript that is rendering in a user's browser, I can start to do pretty nasty things to that user. And depending on how I choose to use that power I have to render stuff in their browser, that may also result in attacks on the attacks on the site that facilitated that situation in the first place. And so it's important to understand the business value of the affected systems, all the data that it's processing, as well as the business impact, public exposure to vulnerability. And that's something that I noticed. we had a situation a while back where we had an organization we were working with that was targeted by Anonymous, and there were a lot of claims of like, oh, well, this website, this site has been defaced, and look how clever Anonymous was. And what they had done is they had identified a page that would essentially have reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability, and people were passing around these links saying, look at how this site has been defaced. Well, it wasn't the site has been defaced, but it was that the site allowed folks to render arbitrary HTML content in the browser, and so to all folks that would click on a link and view it, they would say, yeah, well, this is their site. It was rendered by their server. It's got a bunch of junk on it. Again, it was the result of a reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability, and from a PR standpoint, made it look as if the problems with their systems were more serious than they were otherwise. And that's, again, something that I think is always important to understand is that for an attacker, the victory doesn't necessarily have to be, attackers are going to have different goals, and one goal might be to take down a system or steal data. And in a lot of cases, especially with like chaotic actors, their goal is just to make you look bad. Their goal is to impact your brand and make you look bad, for whatever reason. And so, again, although the data impact of that particular vulnerability wasn't very high, the brand impact was, made it more serious than the technical underpinnings of it might have been. So, how do you mitigate these scenarios? Again, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail about this, but positively validating inputs. Right, if something's supposed to be a string that's only a certain length, make sure it's a string of only a certain length, and that's going to avoid, if you've, again, like in that username scenario, if on the server side you're saying, well, I've got a username, it's supposed to be 8 to 12 characters. Well, 8 to 12 characters, you can't put a lot of interesting JavaScript in 8 to 12 characters. Right? And so you may still have a reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability, but if the payload can only be 12 characters long, that's going to impact impact the seriousness of an exploit of that vulnerability. Similar, if you're with type. All right, I can't think of a lot of. There's probably people more clever than me, but I can't think of a good integer that would be a really interesting cross-site scripting payload. There's people far more clever than me, and somebody's probably figured that out. But if you're validating for type and say, well, this is only supposed to be an integer, let's make sure it's an integer. Same thing, syntax, business rules. All of those aren't going to cure the underlying problem, which is, hey, your application takes inputs and feeds it back out to this browser without properly encoding them. But that will limit the impact, either increasing the skill of the attacker required to successfully exploit a vulnerability, as well as limiting the impact that they might have. So again, great advice, doesn't fix the problem, but limits the impact of it is positively validating inputs. The way that you actually fix cross-site scripting vulnerabilities is that you make sure that when you take potentially malicious data, you render it out, encoding it as appropriate to what that data is going to be. And so if you've got, if you're rendering HTML, you need to HTML encode everything and make sure that for example, these HTML special characters, left bracket becomes &LT, right bracket becomes &GT, and so on and so forth. So you need to make sure, if you're saying, hey, I've got text, when you render that text, you need to either encode it, again, as HTML. If that text is going to be included in an HTML attribute, then you need to encode it as as if it were going to be encoded in an HTML attribute, and so on and so forth. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's the actual way that you solve this, much as how we solved the injection flaws earlier. So you could argue that cross-site scripting is really just like an HTML or a JavaScript injection flaw, and you'd be pedantic and right. You'd be technically right, which is the best kind of right. But just as we solve that problem by making sure that, hey, if I pass in a malicious string, it's encoded so the database treats it as a string. Here, we need to make sure that these potentially malicious elements are encoded so that they're treated as HTML, or they're treated as HTML attributes, or wherever they get rendered in that in the page. Input validation again. As just kind of blanket secure coding advice, that's going to solve a whole lot of problems for you. We've looked at systems. There's one system in particular, I'm saying, a really big, giant web application system built without a lot of thought about security. after the fact, had us come in and do a bunch of assessment work, and we found a whole bunch of vulnerabilities, but we did not have a lot of success exploiting those vulnerabilities, because one of the things that they did is they had extremely strict input validation. That was something done more from a usability standpoint, from a, hey, we can't mess, like this causes business problems downstream if we're not careful with this. So they had very draconian input validation. And the security impact of that was, even though they had written applications that had vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities were very difficult to exploit because, again, it's challenging to fit payloads into small areas if you're validating, stripping out control characters and things like that. So you never want to trust anything that crosses a trust boundary. And again, this input validation discussion is not specific to cross-site scripting. It's for cross-site scripting and just in general, for life in general, input validation is good. But you never want to trust anything that has crossed a trust boundary. So in a web application, that means anything in a GET basically everything in the HTTP request, you have to assume is under the control of bad guys. And that's a paradigm shift for a lot of developers that can be challenging to make. But that's from a thinking standpoint, that is the way to view anything in that HTTP request. And the most common things that you'd be accessing would be GET parameters, POST parameters, HTTP headers, especially cookies are the ones that get used the most, but refer headers and things like that. Anything in an HTTP request is completely under the control of an attacker. And so has anybody here used like OWASP ZAP, the Z attack proxy? A couple of folks, that was, I'm sure we've got a link to it in here somewhere, or just Google for OWASP ZAP, Z-A-P. That's a super handy tool, pretty friendly for new users. And what it lets you do is it lets you basically, tell your browser, hey, I want to send all my browser through ZAP before it goes to the target site. And so you can see all the requests and the contents of the requests that the browser is making. And what ZAP also lets you do is it lets you stop the requests before they go out. So you can go in and change anything that you want, and then send it onto the server side. And so again, anything that's in an HTTP request that comes to your web application, you have to expect that is under the control of an attacker. And so what we see here is, let's look at a crappy cross-site scripting payload. We want to send in the payload of script. If we've got input validation that says, well, the length should be less than 20, well, bracket script bracket is less than 20, so that is going to allow it to pass. But if we also have a restriction that says this can only be, either lowercase or capital A to Z and the digits 0 through 9, that's going to fail because the left and the right script brackets are going to be disallowed. And so, again, looking at defense in depth, if we're saying, well, how long is this supposed to be? What characters are acceptable? Do I need to validate this against some set of rules? In doing that, you're going to take the wide set of possible exploits or attacks that someone may send to your application, and some subset of those are going to be disallowed by the validation. So if we look at one approach, negative or blacklist validation, this approach says if we know that certain things are bad, let's reject it. And I'm just going to say that, and I think there's an example later where we'll be looking at the MySpace worm, the Sammy Kamkar's MySpace worm, which is the best example I've seen of the failure of blacklist validation. If you look at the list of strings that MySpace had disallowed, like they had been very thorough disallowing, saying, hey, I know we don't want to let people store this type of stuff in their profile. So you reject the known bad. Ultimately for them, that approach failed, even though they had a lot of things that they were blocking. And so the challenge here is that adopting the strategy means you've got to adopt a list of known bad characters or patterns. And and especially if you like for really draconian stuff, you may have tens of regular expressions that need to be run, and that may not be realistic from a performance standpoint to do that, and it may not be reasonable for you to maintain that. I would contrast this with positive or whitelisting validation, which says accept the known good. And so you want to check that the input fits a specific set of constraints. And so you want to look for things, what is the type of this data supposed to be? What is the length of the data? What's the range it's supposed to be? If it's a numeric, is it supposed to be a positive integer? Is it supposed to be a monetary value? Is it signed? Is it not supposed to be signed? Syntax or grammar in certain situations. And so by understanding that lets you, number one, it forces you to be very explicit about about the requirements of your application, which is a good thing. And that gives you a good idea of what is the stuff that I expect to see. Also looking at things, again, is the field required, characters and things like that. So let's look at, to kind of contrast these validation strategies. On the left, if we're saying I want to block bracket script and I want to block on-click equals, if you think of that circle being the entire possible set of inputs that could come to your application, which is essentially infinite, right? The infinite wide world of strings that a bad guy can type. What we've done is we've identified a tiny, tiny subset of everything that we know we don't like and that we want to block. All right, so we're blocking very specific attacks versus positive validation, where we're saying the world is a giant, scary place. The only inputs I want to allow through is this tiny subset of stuff that I know is going to be correct. And so in the case above, we've got good things pass through, but also a number of bad things pass through, even though certain bad things get blocked. With the positive validation, the hope is that all the bad things are getting blocked. We're only allowing certain things in. And if you think about the payloads we looked at for SQL injection, apostrophe or 1 equals 1, right? Okay, well we probably don't want to see apostrophe or 1 equals 1. What's the same as apostrophe or 1 equals 1? Apostrophe or 2 equals 2. Apostrophe or 3 equals 3. Probably works with 4 as well. 5, 6, 11. And so you can hopefully you can kind of get a feeling for the ultimate futility of trying to maintain a blacklist of things that you don't like, versus identifying what you actually do like. Looking at a couple of output encoding examples here in Java. Again, if you're encoding for HTML, there's any number of ways that you want to transform these characters, because sometimes, so when we talk about validation, even if we have very strong validation, there are cases where that isn't going to work, right? So if we're trying to guard against SQL injection and we're building a user management site, right? That works great for Dan Cornell, right? We can say, well, your first name has to be this many, below this length, and has to be alphabetic characters, right? Dan Cornell works great. Josh Sokol works great. My buddy Brendan O'Malley from high school, not so good, right? So all of Ireland now cannot use your site if you're blocking apostrophes, or you have to say oh no, I'm going to have to accommodate people that have these SQL control characters in their name, right? And so that's why input validation is tremendously valuable, but isn't going to solve the problem, because there are going to be cases where, if you've got a message board for Irish mathematicians, right? You're going to have to allow apostrophes in the last names, and you're going to have to allow left brackets and right brackets and other math symbols in the posts that you upload, right? And so input validation, where properly applied, is going to potentially reduce your exposure. But at the end of the day, the way that these problems get solved is through output encoding. And so you need to know when you're making a SQL request, this database interpreter expects a single quote inside of a string to be escaped is 2 single quotes or something like that, right? And again, that's something you don't want to mess with. Turn it over to prepared statements. Turn it over to stored procedures. In these cases, for cross-site scripting, you've got to also do encoding, of when I have to be able to render right brackets and left brackets in a web page, right? I mean, HTML was made to communicate physics papers with people. We need to be able to display these special symbols, but those special symbols also mean something from a control character standpoint to your HTML interpreter, to your HTML rendering engine. And so if you want to show on screen these characters, like the left bracket, the right bracket, you've got to encode those as ampersand LT semicolon, ampersand GT semicolon. And by doing that encoding, that actually fixes the problem, because that says you can send, if we know that this is text to be displayed, it needs to be encoded like this so that the HTML rendering engine is going to treat it in that way. And this actually solves the problem, because it says no matter what kind of weird stuff you send in and store in the database or reflect through a parameter, when it goes through the server side, we're going to encode that as appropriate, so the receiving browser treats it as data to be displayed, not as instructions to be processed. Any questions about that? Kind of the difference between input validation, which is great, and output encoding, which actually solves, ultimately solves your problem. Most web frameworks, Java, again, between like Spring or Struts, they've got different capabilities. Same thing in a .NET environment, they give you the ability to do, input validation. One thing I'll note, any input validation done on the client side, like you're using JavaScript to do input validation, that's great from a usability standpoint, doesn't have any security impact. Because again, if you're thinking about a situation where we're using something like an OWASP Zap, I can go through and obey all the rules for input validation, click send on the request. If I catch that in Zap and modify it, I can go and re-break all those rules again before that request hits the server side. This input validation from a security standpoint needs to be done on the server side. Similarly, most frameworks these days have output encoding libraries. It is far preferable to use the framework libraries as opposed to rolling your own. Again, same thing in a Java environment and a .NET environment. If you're doing Python, Python, Ruby, so on and so forth. So output encoding, again, most platforms give you the ability to have functions to do this, and you want to make sure to do that to any user-supplied data before it gets sent out on that HTML stream coming down to the user's browser. Cross-site scripting, like the injection flaws, and again, because cross-site scripting at the end of the day is an injection flaw, is often pretty easy to find a lot of cases using automation. And so much as we had that request and response pattern for SQL injection, where we passed in a SQL control character and look to see an error, with cross-site scripting, we can pass in HTML special characters and see when those get rendered in the browser, if those have been properly encoded. So if I, again, to test the, like that username example on the login page, if I pass in my username as bracket script bracket, if I see when that comes back, if that is still a raw bracket script bracket, that's indicative of a cross-site scripting vulnerability. If it comes back rendered as ampersand LT semicolon script ampersand GT semicolon, well then I can see, well, this application actually did the encoding before this value got sent back. And so that's the type of testing that you do to identify cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And again, like the commercial scanners are clever because they'll stuff such that it gets stored in the database, then come back later, surf back later to see, when I did this value that I passed in, then that gets stored, it's going to render another page and all that. So the scanning tools are usually pretty good at finding these types of issues. Similar for just like we looked at crafting different SQL payloads. If you're replacing an integer or if you're inside of quotes, that may change the way that you craft your payload. If you're rendering directly in open HTML, or if you're getting rendered inside of an HTML attribute. So you can see kind of the examples of just rendering out in HTML, or rendering inside of an HTML attribute, where we have to close out the attribute, do whatever stuff we wanted to do, and then clean up the HTML so that it's going to start to render again. And the good thing for attackers is that most browsers, from a design standpoint, want to be very accepting of the crap HTML that they'll let you send to it. So from a cleanup standpoint, you often don't have to do too much stuff to keep the browser, to get the browser back on track, rendering stuff. So again, testing for stored cross-site scripting, you can seed the application with HTML and JavaScript payloads, and then recrawl the application. So you might bracket and then some sort of a number that is unlikely that you would see in kind of unique identifier. If you go back and see that that particular bracket wasn't rendered, you can look and see the identifier next to it, and you know, well, this is the entry point, and this is where it came back out. With reflected cross-site scripting, again, you just, like, in the parameter you pass it, you see if it comes back to the browser unescaped. And then testing for DOM-based cross-site scripting, that's really, this is something that is easier to do in a lot of cases with static analysis, where you do code analysis, and basically look for situations where your client-side JavaScript code is accessing or using these, these various constructs. And then, typically you'd have to go and look and see, like, how are we actually doing. What's the logic behind how we're parsing these potentially tainted values and how we're using them, and how we're using them to make decisions. But again, reviewing your use of these constructs in the client-side validation, or in the client-side JavaScript code, is how you can identify potential DOM-based cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So any questions about cross-site scripting? Really, really common. I mean, just as as a developer writing database access code to say, select star from whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's a very, very natural, easy way to write database access if you're not specifically thinking about security. Similarly, again, I'm not a designer, I'm not a great HTML guy, and so I usually think, like, how do I need to get all my tags in line, and then just like dump out whatever value I need here, from the database or from the request. It's easy to not think and say, oh, well, I'm writing an HTML attribute, let me make sure to attribute encode this. Or I'm writing some HTML, let me make sure to properly HTML encode this. It's really easy to not think about these types of things. And that is the impact of that is the prevalence of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. To Josh's point, about the contractor he used, where like, hey, I got my code, cool, with 4 free cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Because that's something a lot of folks don't necessarily think about. Any questions? All right. Take a lunch or break.
All right. So here's how lunch is going to work.